Hi, everybody. It's Mary, the OG Woo-Woo therapist, coming to you again from my home office. And as usual, everything I talk about today is not intended to take the place of counseling or therapy, but to highlight some of the issues that could or need to be addressed with a licensed counselor or therapist. None of the information that I'm going to talk about should be used to self-diagnose or diagnose anyone else with a mental health disorder or identification of any of the issues related to the topics that I'm going to talk about today. Please consult a licensed professional. Today I'm going to talk about dissociative identity disorder. In both popular media and clinical spaces, dissociative identity disorder, or DID, is often framed as anomalous or sensational and something to be afraid of. However, within trauma-focused psychiatry and psychology, DID is increasingly conceptualized as a coherent developmental adaptation to overwhelming and chronic threat. This episode approaches DID not as a collection of dramatic symptoms, but as an organized response of the developing mind to conditions in which integration of developing parts of personality was neither safe nor biologically feasible. I will use clinical metaphor with formal theory, not as simplification, but as fidelity to how dissociation is structured and experienced. According to Howell in their 2011 publication, dissociation does not manifest as criteria. It manifests as lived organization. I would like to begin with conceptualizing DID beyond the diagnostic criteria found in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the primary guide for diagnosing dysfunction, illness, injury, or mental health, or the diagnostician's Bible. From a diagnostic standpoint, dissociative identity disorder is defined by the presence of two or more distinct identity states, accompanied by recurrent amnesia and disruptions in consciousness, memory, affect, and sense of self. Yet the diagnostic description alone does not adequately capture the internal logic or developmental function of the disorder or establishment of multiple personalities. Some of the clinical presentations include long histories of treatment-resistant depression or anxiety, multiple mental health diagnoses over time, and inconsistent responses to therapy or medication. Many times, clients report things like, parts of me feel separate. I lose time. I'm not always in control. And all of them fear that they are going crazy. Clinically, DID can be conceptualized using an architectural metaphor. The mind develops like a house under construction. Under sufficient safety, rooms remain connected, allowing flexible movement between affect, memory, and identity. And the personality develops normally and is well integrated. In the context of inescapable trauma, certain experiential rooms become intolerable to enter because of the trauma that happened in them. Initially, access is restricted. Over time, access is structurally eliminated or the rooms are sealed off. In DID, the architecture itself changes. Separate compartments are constructed to contain specific survival functions like attachment, threat detection, daily functioning, or traumatic memory, and each is isolated to preserve overall system viability. These compartments correspond to dissociative self states, as described in the theory of structural dissociation by van der Haar et al., which I talked about at length in previous podcasts. Psychobiological subsystems organized around the distinct action systems, the way van der Haar describes it, and these distinct action systems operate independently of the rest of the systems. So in other words, there is no information exchange. According to Putnam and Siegel, they identify integration and say that integration or identity integration is a developmental achievement rather than an innate state. Early self states are naturally discrete or separate and become integrated through consistent co-regulation, attachment security, and narrative continuity. This is provided by primary caregivers and is sustained throughout childhood development, adolescence, and young adulthood. One metaphor we can use to think about DID is to think about it like an orchestra. Early identity development resembles an orchestra without a conductor. Different instruments play independently. Over time, a coordinating system or a conductor allows modulation and coherence, and the end result is a symphony with depth and character. In severe developmental trauma, this coordinating system does not consolidate. The conductor never appears, which motivates certain instruments to continue to play in isolation because the material they carry, the music they have, is terror, pain, rage. And it cannot be safely integrated into the whole, and it feels like disorganization and instruments working at cross purposes. The goal then is to organize the instruments into a band of some kind, a rock band, like a rock band or a jazz ensemble, where all of the players have equal status and importance, and as time goes on, begin to produce their own music with no one of them as the sum total of the band. However, like with rock bands and jazz ensembles, they can have a frontman or a lead vocalist. Empirical literature consistently links DID to early repeated interpersonal trauma occurring during sensitive periods of neurodevelopment. From this perspective, dissociation represents an adaptive neurobiological response, not a primary pathology. I would like to demonstrate this by asking you to consider this composite case of Anna, we'll call her. Anna presents as high functioning and reflective. She also reports recurrent amnesia for everyday actions, for example, like written notes, making purchases, finding things that she doesn't remember buying, having conversations that people tell her she had with them, and chores that are done, but she has no recall of doing any of them. What becomes apparent over time is not disorganization, but functional specialization, like a hospital system with many specialized physicians or departments. In some dissociative states, Anna experiences herself as a young child where she's hypervigilant and fear-dominated and preoccupied with immediate safety. In others, she's emotionally constricted, procedural, and task-oriented. According to Vanderhart et al. And Liotti, each state corresponds to a specific action system, like an attachment cry, defensive mobilization, daily living, or threat monitoring. That can look like a pediatrician, emergency room doctor, general medicine doctor, and radiologist in a hospital system. Ike et al. And Reinders et al. State that amnesia between states reflects state-dependent encoding and retrieval. Memory remains intact, but inaccessible across dissociative boundaries. This looks like the structure of hospital system departments. They're separated by and have their own specializations where movement is possible from one department to another, but never occupying more than one department at a time, with no recall of having visited any of the other departments because there's no information transmission. So let's talk about a minute for what DID is not. It is not schizophrenia, although many with DID are diagnosed as having schizophrenia. And one of the ways of distinguishing between schizophrenia and dissociative disorders, especially DID, is a follow-up question to when we ask, do you hear voices? When the person responds, yes, I hear voices, then we ask, does it sound like the voices come from the outside, or do they sound like they're on the inside? This is a qualitative difference between schizophrenia and DID. Also, DID is not psychosis, although many are diagnosed with this because of the internal voices. It is not attention-seeking or role-playing. It's not a personality disorder, and it is not caused by suggestion or therapy. Let's address some of the persistent clinical myths about DID. Despite a robust evidence base, misconceptions about DID persist both within public discourse and clinical training. Even many behavioral health professionals hold the mythical perception that folks with DID are just pretending or making stuff up. And frequently, I will have clients say, sometimes I feel like I'm making this up. This is frequently stated by professionals as they don't believe in it. Some of the clinical evidence is clearly demonstrated in the Apple Plus miniseries, The Crowded Room, which is an adaptation of the Billy Milligan story, who was the first person with multiple personalities to go on trial for attempted murder. It ended with him being confined to a mental hospital instead of prison because he had DID. It was a major uphill battle for his psychiatrist and attorney to get the court and jury to understand the nature of what was going on with Billy's development as a child that created the need for multiple personalities. And this is explored pretty thoroughly in this miniseries. And it is true that other accounts of his story portray him in a lot of different ways. I think one is the demon within or something like that. But when we view those other portrayals of him in context of multiple identities, it makes sense that his behavior would vary and be inconsistent depending on the part they were interacting with. Many times I will hear clients say that they sometimes feel like they're making stuff up. And my question to them is always, if you were going to make something up, why would you pick this? And as a follow-up, I ask them, how is it then that you are so disturbed by the memories of something you made up? Another myth is symptom fabrication, which speaks to sometimes the making up of stuff. Neuroimaging and psychophysiology studies demonstrate state-dependent differences in brain activation, sensory processing, and autonomic regulation. And if you want to know about that, you can look up Reinders et al. And Schlumpf et al. There is a miniseries on YouTube and A&E called The Many Sides of Jane, where the documentary folks followed her around for a bit, documenting the multiple parts. In the last episode of the series, or a couple episodes, I think, she goes to this clinic somewhere in Pennsylvania, and they are going to do some brain imaging with her. When they put her in the brain imaging and they caused or triggered a switch while the imaging was going on, the activity in the brain moved to another location at the initiation of the switch. I have included the link for the show if you're interested in watching it. Another myth to talk about is the idea of multiple people. DID reflects one individual with a fragmented internal organization of self, not multiple independent identities. Many times my clients will talk about feeling like different people. However, one of the ways I can help them understand the structure of their identity is by using the metaphor that personality is like a car engine. The engine is consisting of several functional parts like the pistons, carburetor, or fuel pump. And these parts have specialized jobs that they do for the engine to work. If we take the parts individually and give them standalone presence, they are only what they are, which is not helpful or realistic for an engine to be operable. All of the parts of the engine must be attached to the engine for it to work, or the engine doesn't work, and it isn't an engine at all, but a collection of parts that are incapable of doing their job apart from the engine. And when all the parts are attached, it is an engine, not the parts of the engine. So collectively, the parts of personality are one person with many or multiple parts. Dr. Colin Ross, who was part of the committee that worked on the DSM for mental health diagnoses, stated in a training that I attended that he thought the worst thing they did was to pathologize DID. By that, he was talking about the transition from multiple personalities as a descriptive diagnosis to dissociative identity disorder. Making it a disorder is how the medical community pathologized it and made it seem bad, wrong, or a deficit. Part of the struggle with my clients is getting them to understand that they are not sick or unwell, that there is nothing wrong with them, which is what the medical model does by pathologizing DID. There is nothing about the dissociative response for survival to ongoing trauma that is a pathology. It is an amazing ability of the brain to adapt and survive. Another myth is that integration is erasure. Contemporary treatment emphasizes cooperation, co-consciousness, and functional integration, not elimination of parts. Years ago, the stance used to be to eliminate the parts of the personality by forcing integration into one singular sense of self. However, we know today that doesn't work. I do not have DID and frequently will say a part of me feels, thinks, or wants. So to tell someone that survives some of the most horrendous things in their life that they don't get to have a part of them that differs in feeling, thinking, or wanting is a double standard, just in being human, and especially in healing. And it's not useful at all. So we can look at the DID system like a clinical team where effective treatment resembles coordinated teamwork rather than hierarchical suppression. When accessibility is granted to the different parts of the hospital system, and there is a flow of information and integration of care, then functioning begins in a unified way. The same is true for establishing an integrated, unified way for parts of personality to function in an integrated fashion. I have a client that works as a school teacher, and there are multiple parts that go to school every day to perform that job. There is one part that is clearly skilled with working with the kids and understanding them and relating to them. There's another part that is a phenomenal educator, and then another part that deals with the administration and the paperwork. So these parts go to school every day and perform the function of school teacher, which is exciting for me as a therapist to see that begin to happen, to see the formation of the rock band begin. And as we go through the process of healing, we will begin to add other parts into that integrated constellation of parts. However, it may always be only those three parts that go to teach school, which is fine. The other parts don't need to go. But the three parts that are phenomenal at it go every day. Now, in regard to treatment considerations, the International Consensus Guidelines, as put forth by the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, which I'm a member of, endorses a phase-oriented treatment model for DID. And those suggestions were made only as recently as 2011. The phases are stabilization and safety, gradual trauma processing, integration, and rehabilitation. Brand et al. Caution, we have to remember that premature trauma processing increases risk of destabilization and symptom exacerbation. And what that says, that we run the risk of re-traumatizing traumatized parts. We must go slow in the process and take care that we are not forcing, but allowing the parts of personality to establish connection over time. Effective modalities for working with DID are phase-oriented trauma treatment, as mentioned before, and in previous podcasts. Ego state therapy, very, very useful. Modified EMDR, very useful. Parts-informed therapies, not necessarily IFS, but therapies where they are dealing with parts of the self, like IFS, are really very, very successful as well. And as an adjunct to those therapies, using sensory motor or somatic approaches can help the person get in touch with what their body experiences when they are in the different parts of their personality. Many times with DID, people become so dissociated from what their body is experiencing that they don't even realize that they're starving, or they don't realize that they've been seriously injured, or they don't even realize that they stepped wrong on their foot and sprained their ankle or broke it even, because they've dissociated those experiences so profoundly, they don't even know that they're injured or that something is wrong with their body. They just have no connection to it. So with sensory motor and somatic approaches, we're able to reconnect the mind with the body. When working with DID, we have to remember to not treat DID like standard PTSD, not to rush trauma exposure, ignore dissociation during the MDR, invalidating parts is not real, or at the same time, not focusing on parts at the expense of stabilization. In review, let's remember that like remodeling during an earthquake, structural work can't proceed during the ongoing seismic threat. Now, I grew up in Southern California, and I told you about this in the last podcast, where the ground rolls there because of the sandstone and the limestone, and other places, it's sharp, jerky things that happen. So if I were trying to remodel my kitchen while that was actively going on, it wouldn't be a very good remodeling job, which is the same thing about treating dissociation while there is no stabilization. So the effective therapeutic stance is collaborative with the client and the therapist, respectful of protective functions like the dissociation, and it is explicitly paced. We take our time and do one thing at a time. In conclusion, dissociative identity disorder does not represent a deficit of identity, but a system of parts that adapted for survival with remarkable precision under conditions of chronic threat. And it does not matter what that threat was, whether it was physical, mental, emotional, psychological, medical, or any other kind of threat that a child may be exposed to. Each dissociative self state exists because it once served for survival. Early on, my first client that I worked with that had DID, that I mentioned in a previous podcast, had a part that survived being human trafficked. And that part had a very distinctive way of engaging with life. One of the things that we had to do was treat the trauma and allow that part to heal for it to become functional and interactive with the other parts, which is what we're trying to build, is an interactive integration of parts, not elimination of parts. There is no clinical suggestions these days that recommend elimination of parts. Now, it is possible as we go through the trauma healing that other parts will decide that they are going to blend into another part or do a complete integration with another part. That happens in treatment with DID and dissociation. It happens frequently. However, that is not the goal. And we do not dictate how the parts interact with themselves. All we're trying to do is build integrated interaction between the parts for a stabilized presentation in the world where they can live their life. And finally, treatment involves creating sufficient safety for it to become possible for parts to have integration and functioning, not forcing unity, but by allowing it. And with that, I want to thank you for joining me today and giving a listen. And if you enjoyed this content, please give it a like and subscribe so that you can stay informed when the next podcast is released. And I hope that you have a great day. Thank you for listening.